The metallic voice crackled through the cabin speakers with words that made 300 hearts stop beating. "This is First Officer Marcus Webb speaking from the cockpit, and I need everyone to remain calm while I ask an unusual question that has never been asked in my 15 years of flying commercial aircraft. Is there anyone aboard this flight who has actual pilot training or aviation experience of any kind? Because Captain Harrison just collapsed at the controls and I desperately need assistance up here right now." Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Nobody moved in the frozen silence that followed, because commercial airline passengers do not expect their pilot to collapse at 30,000 feet above the ground, and they certainly do not expect to be asked if they can fly a Boeing 737 carrying 312 souls through darkening skies over the Rocky Mountains. The cabin had been peaceful just moments before, filled with the usual sounds of a transcontinental flight from Seattle to Chicago. The hum of engines, quiet conversations, the occasional cry of a baby, the rustle of magazines and snack wrappers. Now every eye was wide with terror, every breath held in collective panic as the reality of their situation crashed down like a physical weight pressing against their chests. In seat 27F, a 16-year-old girl with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail slowly removed her headphones and set down her phone, where moments before she had appeared to be doing exactly what every adult around her assumed she was doing. Scrolling through social media, texting friends, listening to music, being a typical teenager who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with her devices during the boring hours of air travel. Her name was Alexis Lexi Brennan, though nobody on this flight knew that name or would have recognized it even if they heard it, because she traveled under circumstances that required discretion and she carried documentation that listed her simply as a minor flying alone between family obligations that adults assumed involved divorced parents or school programs or any of the ordinary reasons that teenagers fly unaccompanied across the country. The flight attendants had checked on her 3 times since boarding, their voices carrying that particular tone adults use with teenagers they assume need supervision. Friendly but slightly patronizing, making sure she knew where the bathroom was located, asking if she wanted extra snacks, treating her like someone who might not understand basic airplane etiquette or need help with her seatbelt even though she was 16 years old and perfectly capable of managing a commercial flight as a passenger. She had smiled politely each time, nodded, gone back to her phone, reinforcing their impression that she was just another quiet kid who preferred solitude over conversation with strangers, someone who would spend the entire 4-hour flight with headphones on and cause no trouble whatsoever. The businessman in 27E had glanced at her when he first sat down, registered her age and her closed-off body language, and immediately decided not to attempt conversation, respecting what he interpreted as a teenager's obvious desire to be left alone with her digital world. The elderly couple in 27C and 27D had smiled at her in that warm way older people smile at young people, but they too had recognized the universal teenager signal of headphones and downcast eyes that said, "Please do not try to make small talk with me," and they had honored that boundary throughout the flight. The young mother across the aisle with 2 small children had been too busy managing her own family to pay attention to the solitary teenager who seemed perfectly self-sufficient and content to be invisible among the crowd of travelers. This was exactly how Lexi preferred it, because drawing attention to herself would raise questions she could not answer, and her presence on this particular flight was already complicated enough without adults becoming curious about who she was or where she was going or why a 16-year-old was flying alone without visible signs of parental supervision beyond the airline's unaccompanied minor protocols. She carried a standard teenage backpack that could belong to any high school student. Notebooks, pens, a laptop, charging cables, snacks, a water bottle, earbuds, all the normal items that would not trigger any second glances from security or fellow passengers. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything other than an ordinary teenager making an ordinary trip for ordinary reasons. But Lexi Brennan was not ordinary, though she had spent her entire 16 years learning how to appear exactly that way in civilian settings, because her father had taught her from early childhood that the most dangerous operators are the ones nobody notices until the moment they need to be noticed. Her father was Colonel James Reaper Brennan, United States Air Force, whose call sign was legendary in military aviation circles for reasons that were still classified at the highest levels of government security, involving combat missions and tactical achievements that would never appear in public records or history books that civilians could read. The call sign Reaper had been earned through actions in hostile airspace that saved countless lives and accomplished objectives that changed the course of conflicts in ways the public would never know, and among fighter pilots and military aviators, that call sign commanded instant respect and recognition. Lexi had grown up in that world, moving from one military base to another, living in housing where neighbors were other military families who understood operational security and never asked questions about fathers who disappeared for months at a time on deployments they could not discuss. She had attended schools on military bases where children of pilots and soldiers and intelligence officers learned early that some topics were never discussed outside secured spaces, where everyone understood that parents sometimes left on short notice and returned with injuries or medals or silence about where they had been. She had spent her childhood around aircraft and hangars and flight operations, absorbing knowledge that most teenagers would never encounter, watching her father and his squadron prepare for missions with precision and discipline that became as familiar to her as the sound of jet engines screaming across runways at dawn. Her father had trained her because he believed that knowledge was survival, because military families lived with risks that civilian families never faced, because he wanted his daughter to be capable of handling emergencies that would overwhelm normal teenagers who grew up without understanding how systems work and how to think clearly when everything around them is falling apart. He had taught her to read aviation charts when she was 10 years old, explaining flight instruments and navigation systems during long evenings when he was home between deployments, using training manuals and simulator programs to show her how pilots think and react during critical situations. He had taken her to air shows and let her sit in cockpits and introduced her to other pilots who shared their knowledge with the understanding that Colonel Brennan's daughter was not a casual enthusiast but a serious student of aviation who absorbed information like someone preparing for something important. By the time she was 14, Lexi could read instrument panels that would look like incomprehensible collections of dials and screens to most adults, could understand radio communications between pilots and air traffic control, could explain emergency procedures and backup systems and failure protocols that commercial passengers never think about when they board flights assuming everything will work perfectly. She had studied her father's flight manuals and tactical documents with permission he granted because he trusted her discretion and wanted her educated beyond what civilian schools taught teenagers about physics and engineering and decision-making under pressure. She had learned not just the technical aspects of aviation but the psychology of it, the way pilots are trained to suppress panic and follow procedures and communicate clearly even when their aircraft is falling out of the sky and every instinct screams at them to freeze or run or give up. This knowledge was not something she advertised, because teenagers who understand complex aviation systems and military tactical operations do not fit into normal social categories, and Lexi had learned early that being different in visible ways made life harder at civilian schools where other teenagers cared about sports and dating and social media popularity rather than flight envelopes and emergency descent procedures. She had friends at various bases who understood her background because they shared similar experiences. Children of military pilots and special operations personnel who grew up with knowledge that set them apart from civilian peers. But in civilian spaces, on commercial flights, in public settings where she traveled alone for reasons related to her father's assignments and her mother's work with military family support programs, she became invisible by choice, just another teenager with headphones and a phone who wanted to be left alone. The announcement from First Officer Webb had changed everything, and Lexi sat very still for perhaps 10 seconds while her mind processed the situation with training that kicked in automatically even though she had never expected to use it in exactly these circumstances. Her father had drilled into her that emergencies reveal who people really are, that crisis situations strip away all the comfortable pretenses of normal life and show whether someone has the capacity to act or whether they will freeze and become part of the problem instead of part of the solution. She could hear adults around her beginning to panic, voices rising in fear. Someone crying, someone else demanding to know what was happening, the businessman beside her gripping his armrests with white knuckles while his breathing became rapid and shallow. Nobody was moving toward the cockpit, because commercial airline passengers do not volunteer to fly aircraft they are not qualified to operate, and everyone aboard assumed that the co-pilot's desperate request was essentially unanswerable, that they were all going to die because there could not possibly be anyone on this flight with the knowledge and skill to help with a situation this catastrophic. The flight attendants were trying to maintain order while clearly struggling with their own fear, moving through the cabin asking passengers to remain seated while their faces showed they understood the gravity of what was happening, that their training had not prepared them for the pilot becoming incapacitated at cruising altitude with no backup plan except hoping someone aboard had relevant experience. Lexi unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movements so calm and deliberate that the businessman beside her did not immediately register what she was doing. She stepped into the aisle and began walking forward toward the cockpit, her stride steady and purposeful, and the flight attendant near the front of the cabin saw her approaching and immediately moved to intercept her with an expression that mixed concern and confusion, clearly wondering why a teenage girl was leaving her seat during an emergency announcement that had just revealed their pilot was unconscious. "Sweetie, you need to return to your seat and buckle your seatbelt," the flight attendant said, her voice strained with stress but still trying to maintain professional courtesy even though her hands were trembling. We're dealing with an emergency situation and all passengers must remain seated until we have more information about what's happening and how we're going to proceed. I heard the announcement, Lexi said quietly, her voice carrying none of the panic that filled the cabin around them. The co-pilot asked if anyone has aviation experience, and I need to speak with him immediately because I can help with this situation. And every second we waste having this conversation is a second we don't have to spare right now. The flight attendant looked at her with disbelief that was almost comical despite the circumstances, because this was clearly a 16-year-old girl, obviously a minor, someone who should not be approaching the cockpit during any circumstances and certainly not during a critical emergency when the captain was incapacitated. I appreciate that you want to help, the flight attendant said with the kind of patience adults use when humoring children who do not understand the seriousness of adult situations. But this is a very serious emergency that requires professional expertise, and I need you to return to your seat right now before I have to call for assistance to escort you back. My name is Alexis Brennan, Lexi said, her voice still calm but with an edge that made the flight attendant pause. My father is Colonel James Brennan, call sign Reaper, United States Air Force, and I have extensive aviation training that your co-pilot desperately needs right now. I understand you're following protocols for dealing with passengers during emergencies, but I'm asking you to break those protocols and let me into that cockpit before this situation gets worse, because I promise you that I know what I'm doing and I can help First Officer Webb stabilize this flight. The flight attendant stared at her, clearly struggling to process what she was hearing, because teenagers do not talk like this and do not claim to have aviation expertise that could help with professional pilot emergencies. Other passengers nearby were watching now, their fear momentarily distracted by this strange confrontation between a flight attendant and a teenage girl who was speaking with confidence that seemed impossible given her age. Someone behind them muttered something about kids watching too many movies, someone else said this was not the time for games, and the collective assumption was clear. This girl was either delusional or attention-seeking or somehow not understanding the reality of their situation. But the flight attendant had been trained to recognize genuine authority beneath unexpected surfaces. And something in Lexi's eyes and voice triggered instincts that said this was not a teenager playing pretend or trying to be helpful without understanding the situation. The use of military terminology, the specific mention of a call sign and rank, the way she spoke without hysteria or bravado but with simple directness that suggested she genuinely believed she could contribute something valuable, these details added up to something that seemed impossible but could not be immediately dismissed as fantasy. Wait here, the flight attendant said, making a split-second decision that violated her training but matched her intuition that this situation was so far outside normal parameters that normal rules might not apply. She moved quickly to the cockpit door, knocked in a specific pattern, spoke through the intercom with urgency, and moments later the reinforced door opened a crack to reveal First Officer Marcus Webb's face, pale with stress and exhaustion, his eyes showing the strain of trying to fly the aircraft and manage a medical emergency simultaneously while knowing that hundreds of lives depended on decisions he was making alone without the support of his captain. The flight attendant spoke rapidly to Webb, explaining that a teenage passenger was claiming aviation expertise and military family connections, and Lexi could see the co-pilot's expression shift through multiple reactions in seconds. Skepticism, desperation, calculation, and finally a kind of grim willingness to consider anything that might help because their situation was deteriorating and he had no good options available. He looked past the flight attendant directly at Lexi, studying her with the quick assessment pilots learn to make when evaluating whether someone can be trusted with critical information or responsibility. What's your father's call sign? Webb asked, his voice rough with stress but sharp with focus. Reaper, Lexi replied immediately. Colonel James Brennan, 37th Fighter Squadron, previously stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, currently assigned to classified operations I cannot discuss in open spaces. His squadron commander is Colonel Patricia Morrison, call sign Viper, and his wingman is Major David Chin, call sign Dragon. I can provide additional verification details if you need them, but I'm asking you to let me into that cockpit now because you need help and I have training that can make a difference in how this emergency resolves. Webb's expression changed completely, because those were not details a teenager would know unless she genuinely had access to military aviation circles where call signs and squadron assignments were common knowledge. The name Reaper carried weight among pilots who followed military aviation news and understood which call signs represented legendary careers, and while Webb had never met Colonel Brennan personally, he had heard stories about missions and achievements that made that particular call sign recognizable to anyone who paid attention to fighter pilot communities. Get in here, Webb said, pulling the cockpit door fully open and gesturing for Lexi to enter quickly. I don't know how much you actually know, but Captain Harrison had a massive stroke about 4 minutes ago and I've got this aircraft on autopilot while trying to coordinate with air traffic control and figure out emergency landing options, and I could use an extra set of hands and eyes even if you're just reading checklists or helping me monitor instruments while I focus on flying. Lexi stepped into the cockpit and immediately processed the scene with training that allowed her to see past the emotional chaos to the technical reality of their situation. Captain Harrison was slumped in his seat, unconscious and unresponsive, his breathing labored and irregular, clearly experiencing a severe medical emergency that required immediate hospitalization that was impossible at 30,000 feet above mountainous terrain. The instrument panel showed the aircraft was stable in level flight under autopilot control, but Lexi knew that autopilot systems could not handle the complex decision-making required for emergency situations, could not communicate with air traffic control, could not manage the dozens of critical tasks that pilots handle continuously during normal operations and especially during crises. First Officer Webb looked exhausted and overwhelmed, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the cockpit, his movements showing the strain of trying to do 2 jobs simultaneously while dealing with the psychological shock of watching his captain collapse without warning during routine cruise operations. He was young for a first officer, probably late 20s or early 30s, competent enough to have earned his position but clearly not experienced enough to handle this situation with the calm confidence that comes from decades of flying through every possible emergency scenario. What do you need me to do? Lexi asked, her voice cutting through the chaos with clarity that made Webb focus on her completely. I need to get Captain Harrison out of his seat so I can secure him properly and make sure he's not going to interfere with flight controls if he has a seizure or convulsion, Webb said rapidly, speaking faster than normal as stress compressed his communication into bursts of essential information. Then I need to coordinate with Denver Center about emergency landing options because we're currently over the Rockies and we need to find an airport that can handle a wide-body aircraft with full emergency response capabilities. I need to calculate fuel consumption and descent profiles and brief the cabin crew about emergency procedures, and I need to do all of this while flying the aircraft because autopilot can only do so much and I cannot afford to make mistakes with 300 people depending on me to get this right. Okay, Lexi said, already moving toward Captain Harrison's position with confidence that came from growing up around military pilots who trained constantly for emergency procedures. I'll help you move Captain Harrison, then I'll take the right seat and assist with communications and checklist procedures while you focus on flying and making command decisions. I know Boeing systems and I can read instruments and I understand emergency protocols, so tell me what you need and I'll do it exactly as you direct without questioning or hesitating. Webb stared at her for a moment, clearly struggling to process that a 16-year-old girl was speaking with competence that matched experienced crew members, but desperation overrode skepticism and he nodded sharply. Together they carefully moved Captain Harrison from his seat, a difficult task in the confined cockpit space that required coordination and strength Lexi had developed through years of military fitness training that her father insisted was essential for anyone who might need to handle physical emergencies. They secured Harrison in a position where he could not accidentally contact any controls, and Lexi could see that his condition was grave, his breathing shallow and his color poor, indications that he needed intensive medical care far beyond what could be provided in an aircraft cockpit at altitude. Lexi slid into the right seat, the captain's seat, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her even though she was not actually flying the aircraft yet. The instrument panel surrounded her with information, and she processed it automatically through training that her father had drilled into her over years of study: airspeed, altitude, heading, engine parameters, fuel quantity, navigation displays, weather radar. Dozens of systems all reporting their status through digital displays and analog gauges that told the complete story of the aircraft's condition and environment. Everything showed normal operations except for the most critical system of all, the human pilots, where one was unconscious and the other was barely holding together under impossible stress. Webb returned to the left seat and immediately grabbed the radio microphone, his hand shaking slightly as he keyed the transmission. Denver Center, United 2847, we have an urgent situation here. Captain has become incapacitated due to apparent stroke, currently unconscious and unresponsive. First officer is at controls with assistance from a passenger with aviation training. We need immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport with full emergency response capabilities, and we need to begin descent as soon as possible because we're running on minimum crew and I need to get this aircraft on the ground before anything else goes wrong. The reply came back immediately, the air traffic controller's voice professionally calm but with an undercurrent of concern that showed he understood the gravity of their situation. United 2847, Denver Center copies your emergency. Understand you have pilot incapacitation and are requesting immediate diversion. Stand by while we coordinate with surrounding facilities and emergency services. Current position shows you approximately 140 miles west of Denver International. Can you maintain present altitude and heading while we work up vectors and landing clearance? Affirmative, maintaining flight level 310 and present heading, Webb replied, his training overriding his stress to deliver clear professional communication even though his hands were gripping the control yoke with tension that showed through his shoulders. We have sufficient fuel for extended holding if necessary, but I would prefer to begin descent and approach as soon as practicable because our crew situation is not stable and I want to minimize time at altitude with only one qualified pilot at the controls. Lexi was already pulling up navigation displays and calculating descent profiles, her fingers moving across screens with familiarity that came from hundreds of hours in flight simulators and training programs that her father had provided access to through military connections. She understood how to read instrument approach procedures and calculate descent rates and determine optimal glide slopes that would bring a heavy aircraft down safely from cruising altitude without creating passenger discomfort or structural stress. She pulled up weather information for Denver International, noting wind conditions and visibility and runway configurations, processing data that would be essential for planning their approach and landing. Denver International current conditions show winds 270 at 12 knots, visibility 10 miles, ceiling broken at 2,500 feet, Lexi said clearly, reading from displays that showed real-time weather data uplinked to the aircraft systems. Runways 35 left and 35 right are active for arrivals based on current traffic flow. Both are 12,000 feet and have full ILS approaches available. We should request runway 35 left because it has better emergency vehicle access and can keep us clear of other traffic while we work through landing procedures. Webb looked at her sharply, surprised by her use of proper terminology and her apparent understanding of airport operations and approach planning. "How do you know all this?" he asked, momentarily distracted from his overwhelming task load by the impossibility of a teenager speaking like an experienced crew member. "My father taught me," Lexi said simply. "He believed that knowledge might save my life someday, and he spent 16 years making sure I understood how complex systems work and how to think clearly during emergencies. I'm not a licensed pilot and I'm not claiming I can fly this aircraft, but I can assist you with procedures and calculations and communications so you can focus on the actual flying and decision-making that requires your experience and authority as pilot in command." The radio crackled again with Denver Center calling back. "United 2847, we have coordination complete for your emergency diversion. You are clear to descend and maintain flight level 240, proceed direct to the Denver VORTAC. Expect vectors for ILS approach to runway 35 left. Emergency equipment will be standing by, medical facilities are being alerted for priority ambulance response upon landing. Souls on board and fuel remaining?" Webb keyed the microphone. "United 2847 descending to flight level 240 direct Denver VORTAC. We have 312 souls on board including crew, fuel remaining approximately 22,000 pounds. We will require medical transport immediately upon landing for incapacitated crew member who experienced apparent stroke at altitude approximately 10 minutes ago." Lexi was already working through descent checklists, calling out items from memory that her father had made her memorize because he said pilots who needed to read basic procedures during emergencies were pilots who had not prepared adequately for their responsibilities. "Descent checklist," she said, her voice steady. "Pressurization controls set for descent, passenger signs activated, cabin crew notified, altimeters cross-checked and set for destination field elevation, landing data computed and verified, approach briefing to be completed prior to final approach fix." Webb glanced at her again, and this time his expression showed something beyond surprise. It showed recognition that whoever this teenager was, she had genuine training that was proving invaluable during a crisis where every small task he could delegate to someone competent freed his mental capacity to focus on the critical tasks that only he could perform as the remaining qualified pilot aboard. He began the descent, carefully managing the throttles and flight controls to bring the massive aircraft down smoothly through the thinner air at high altitude while monitoring multiple systems and preparing mentally for the approach and landing that would require absolute precision with no margin for error. Behind them in the main cabin, passengers were experiencing their own crisis of fear and uncertainty, because the announcement about pilot incapacitation had created exactly the kind of panic that airline crews trained to prevent. Flight attendants were moving through the aisles trying to provide reassurance while secretly sharing their own terror about what was happening in the cockpit. because they understood better than passengers that flying is a two-pilot operation and losing half the crew during cruise operations was a nightmare scenario that rarely ended well. Some passengers were praying, some were crying, some were calling loved ones on their phones despite announcements to keep electronic devices in airplane mode, leaving messages that sounded like final goodbyes because they assumed this flight was going to crash and kill everyone aboard. In seat 27E, the businessman who had sat next to Lexi was telling other passengers that the teenage girl from his row had gone to the cockpit, and this information spread through the cabin with the speed of gossip that accompanies disaster, creating new waves of confusion and fear as people tried to understand why a child would be in the cockpit during an emergency. Some passengers assumed she was the pilot's daughter. Others worried that the co-pilot was so desperate that he was accepting help from random passengers regardless of qualifications. And everyone agreed that their situation must be far worse than they had imagined if teenagers were being recruited to help fly the aircraft. In the cockpit, Lexi and Webb were working through the complex choreography of emergency descent procedures, their coordination improving with each passing minute as Webb recognized that Lexi genuinely understood what she was doing and could be trusted with tasks that would normally require a qualified crew member. She handled radio communications while he flew, she monitored instruments while he calculated approach parameters, she pulled up procedures and checklists while he made decisions about speeds and configurations and emergency preparations. They fell into a rhythm that resembled the crew resource management that airlines train their pilots to practice, where workload is distributed according to capability and both crew members support each other through clear communication and mutual awareness of the shared goal of landing safely. United 2847, Denver Center, descend and maintain 16,000, reduce speed to 250 knots. Turn left heading 090, vector for downwind to runway 35 left. The controller's voice came through clearly, beginning the sequence of instructions that would guide them into position for landing. Descending to 16,000, reducing to 250 knots, turning left to 090, Lexi replied, handling the radio communication with practiced precision while Webb focused on executing the instructions with careful attention to airspeed and altitude control. The descent continued through multiple altitude assignments as Denver Center guided them lower and positioned them for the approach, vectoring them through airspace that was being cleared of other traffic to give the emergency aircraft priority handling. Other flights were being held or redirected to create a protected corridor for United 2847, and emergency vehicles on the ground were taking positions along runway 35 left, preparing for the possibility that the aircraft might have difficulties during landing that would require immediate response. At 10,000 feet, Webb began the final approach preparation sequence, configuring the aircraft for landing by extending flaps and landing gear, carefully managing the additional drag and changes in handling characteristics that came with extending these systems. Lexi called out each step of the landing checklist, verifying that all systems were responding normally and that they were on track for a stable approach that would bring them to the runway within the parameters that define safe landing operations. The aircraft responded smoothly to Webb's control inputs, the autopilot now disengaged as he hand-flew the final approach with concentration that blocked out everything except the immediate task of guiding 312 people safely to the ground. United 2847, you are cleared for ILS approach runway 35 left. Contact Denver Tower on 118.3, Denver Center said, handing them off to the final controller who would clear them to land. Tower, United 2847 is with you on the ILS 35 left. We have the field in sight. Requesting priority landing clearance for our emergency, Lexi transmitted, switching frequencies smoothly and maintaining professional communication protocols that kept information flowing clearly between aircraft and ground. United 2847, Denver Tower, you are cleared to land runway 35 left. Winds 280 at 10 knots, emergency equipment is standing by. No other traffic is a factor, you have the airport to yourself. Be advised that we have news helicopters in the area monitoring your approach, but they are maintaining safe distance from your flight path. Webb brought the aircraft down through the final approach segment, his hands steady on the controls now despite the stress of the past 30 minutes, his training and experience allowing him to execute the landing with smooth precision even though exhaustion and emotional strain were pulling at the edges of his consciousness. Lexi watched the instruments and called out altitudes and speeds, providing the backup monitoring that helped ensure Webb maintained the exact flight path required for safe landing. The runway appeared ahead through the windscreen, emergency vehicles lined up along its length with lights flashing, creating a corridor of red and white and amber that looked like a strange welcoming ceremony for an aircraft that had just survived a crisis that should have ended in disaster. The main landing gear touched down smoothly, The impact barely noticeable as Webb executed a textbook landing that would have earned praise during normal operations and was even more impressive given the circumstances that brought them to this moment. He deployed thrust reversers and applied brakes with careful modulation, bringing the massive aircraft to a controlled stop while emergency vehicles began rolling alongside them, ready to respond instantly if any problems developed during landing rollout. United 2847 is down and stopped on runway 35 left. We need immediate medical transport to the aircraft for our incapacitated crew member, Lexi transmitted, maintaining her role as communicator while Webb completed the after-landing checklist with movements that showed he was operating on autopilot now that the immediate danger had passed. Copy that. United 2847 medical units are approaching your position now. Remain on the runway and await emergency personnel, Tower replied. Outstanding work bringing that aircraft down safely, both of you. Webb finally released the controls and sat back in his seat, his hands trembling now that the crisis was over and the adrenaline that had kept him focused was draining away, leaving exhaustion in its place. He looked at Lexi with an expression that mixed gratitude and disbelief and something close to awe, because she had just helped him save 312 lives through knowledge and competence that should not exist in someone her age but had proved absolutely essential during the most critical hour of his career. "Who the hell are you?" Webb asked quietly, his voice rough with emotion he was barely containing. "I mean, I know you're Colonel Brennan's daughter, but that doesn't explain how a 16-year-old kid knows how to handle emergency procedures like an experienced crew member who has been flying professionally for years." "I grew up around military aviation," Lexi said simply, removing the headset that looked oversized on her teenage frame. "My father believed that being unprepared was the most dangerous condition someone could live with, so he taught me everything he could about flying and systems and emergency procedures, just in case I ever needed that knowledge. I never expected to need it like this, but I'm glad I had it when you needed help." The cockpit door opened and flight attendants rushed in along with paramedics who immediately began assessing Captain Harrison's condition and preparing to transport him to the waiting ambulance. Other emergency personnel began boarding the aircraft to assist with passenger evacuation and to check for any other medical issues that might have developed during the stressful flight. News helicopters circled overhead capturing footage that would appear on every news broadcast within the hour, showing the emergency landing that had become a major story the moment word spread about a teenage passenger helping to save a flight after the captain collapsed. Airport authority officials and FAA investigators arrived within minutes, beginning the documentation process that follows every aviation emergency, interviewing crew and passengers and reviewing aircraft systems to understand exactly what happened and how the situation was resolved. When they learned that a 16-year-old passenger had been in the cockpit assisting the first officer, their skepticism was immediate and obvious, because regulations do not permit unauthorized personnel in the cockpit and certainly do not envision scenarios where teenagers participate in emergency flight operations regardless of their claimed qualifications. But when they checked Lexi's identification and ran background verification that revealed her connection to Colonel James Reaper Brennan, attitude shifted dramatically, because that call sign opened doors and commanded respect throughout military and civilian aviation communities. Phone calls were made to military liaison offices, which confirmed that Lexi Brennan was indeed the daughter of one of the most decorated fighter pilots in recent military history, that she had grown up with access to aviation training and resources that far exceeded normal civilian education, and that her father's reputation vouched for her competence in ways that official certifications could not match. The story exploded across news media within hours, because the combination of dramatic emergency landing and teenage hero created exactly the kind of narrative that captures public attention and generates millions of views and shares across social media platforms. Video from the news helicopters showed the aircraft landing smoothly despite the crisis that had unfolded at 30,000 feet, and interviews with passengers revealed the collective shock when they learned that the quiet teenage girl who had been sitting silently with her headphones throughout the flight had actually saved their lives by assisting the overwhelmed co-pilot through procedures that required expert knowledge and calm nerves. The businessman from seat 27E gave emotional interviews describing how he had sat next to Lexi for 2 hours assuming she was just another teenager scrolling through her phone, never imagining that she possessed aviation expertise that would prove critical when their pilot collapsed. The flight attendants who had initially tried to send her back to her seat talked about their disbelief when this 16-year-old insisted she could help in the cockpit, and their amazement when they learned she had genuinely saved the flight through competence that exceeded what most adults could demonstrate during such intense crisis situations. Passengers who had been certain they were going to die expressed gratitude and wonder that their lives had been saved by someone young enough to be their daughter or granddaughter. Aviation experts interviewed by news networks initially expressed skepticism that a teenager could have meaningfully contributed to handling a commercial aircraft emergency, suggesting that the co-pilot must have done all the actual work while the passenger merely watched or provided moral support. But First Officer Marcus Webb gave detailed accounts of exactly how Lexi had handled communications and checklists and system monitoring with competence that freed him to focus on flying, emphasizing that without her assistance he would have been task-saturated and potentially unable to manage all the simultaneous demands of the emergency. Other pilots who learned the full details of the incident acknowledged that Lexi had performed at a level equivalent to a qualified crew member, and that her training had indeed made a crucial difference in the outcome. The military aviation community responded with pride and recognition, because Lexi's actions reflected the training and values that Colonel Brennan had instilled in his daughter, demonstrating that children raised in military families absorb capabilities that civilians rarely encounter. Stories emerged about other military children who had similar experiences growing up around advanced operations and classified training, who learned skills far beyond what schools teach because their parents believed in preparing them for emergencies that might never come but could prove lethal if they were unprepared when crisis struck. Colonel James Reaper Brennan arrived at Denver International Airport within 6 hours, traveling from his classified assignment through military transport that moved with the priority reserved for emergency family situations. When he reached his daughter in the private lounge where airport officials had taken her away from the media chaos, he pulled her into a long embrace that communicated pride and relief and love beyond what words could express. He had trained her for exactly this kind of situation without ever wanting her to face it, had given her knowledge that most fathers keep away from their children because it represents dangers they hope their kids will never